everyone. Welcome back to the Mob Archaeologist. I'm here with Rick, Tony, and Eric, and I'm Angelo. And this evening, we're going to be discussing Masseria and how the Morello family turned into the Genovese and Lucchese families.
You guys wrote your article and you dealt with the breakup of the family. So we know the Lucchese and Genovese families split off from the Morellos, who existed at the latest at the beginning of the turn of the century. And then, roughly 20 years later, suddenly these two families surfaced after a warfare when Giuseppe Morello was released from prison after his counterfeiting charge. What were the events that led to the breakup of the family? What was going on then? What caused, it's a rare occurrence for a family to break up. What caused the actual breakup of the family?
Okay, well, a little bit of background. Uh, Giuseppe Morello was the boss of the family. He was also the boss of bosses. And in 1910, he went to prison for counterfeiting. He came out, I believe, in 1920 and wanted to resume his position as boss of the family. In the meantime, there had been some bosses running the family. We had Fortunato, Lamonte, and others. And at the time of his release, there was somebody named Salvatore Lecoino. And Salvatore Lecoino, according to uh, an article written by the former head of the Secret Service, William F. Flynn, he didn't want to give up his position. So Morello had him killed, apparently. And he was only the first of several that were killed, and it led to a conflict between Lecoino's supporters and Morello. And Lecoino also had the support of Salvatore d'Aquila, who became the boss of bosses while Morello was in prison. So there were killings on both sides. And according to Bartolo Fontana, who was an informant after the so-called good killers were captured. This was in 1921. And they were basically a crew for the Bonanos, that time headed by Colasciro. They actually were the shooters, apparently hired by Morello to take care of this group. Morello apparently had a small group of his former family that were loyal to him. So he ended up bringing Joe the Boss Masseria and others as to be the new boss of his former family. So during the conflict, there was a peace settlement in 1923 where D'Aquila recognized Ignacio Lupo, who was the boss of what is now the Gambino family and who was related by marriage to Morello. So they were very close. And but D'Aquila didn't accept Morello back into the fold. So I believe that a compromise was worked out. So Morello took a lower role, maybe as an underboss or consigliere for a while, but more likely the underboss. And so Masseria was now running the family. And previously, Masseria had been affiliated with some Bonanno people. So, Angelo, do you want to take it from there?
Where should I take it? You pretty much already summarized it. So between 1922 and 1924, there was a split between the former Corleonese family that was headed by Morello, then Lamonte, and then eventually Lecoino. These splits, we don't really know how many people went one way or the other. Generally with mob wars, they are internal disputes, and it roughly breaks down to about 30%, pro forces, 30% on the other side, and then you have 30% in the middle who are just neutral. They don't care to get involved in politics. They don't really care who's running it. It has little influence in their life. So these are messy things. With the split up, you had forces that were pro Morello. Many of them were Corleonese, but a lot of them were killed very early. And then you had the other faction, which was also Corleonese, but also people from Maranello. And that eventually became the Lucchese family. With the Morello faction or group, what you see is due to depleted resources, they begin to rely on other people. And this is where Joe Masseria comes in. This is where guys like Rocco Pellegrino appears to come in and other people. So the Morello faction seems to have had to rebuild itself. There are certain questions, though, because this original Corleonese family split, and it ended up becoming one of the largest families in New York City. We don't really know or understand all the intricacies about that, and it does deserve more study.
One factor that could account for the growth of the Masseria family during the 1920s, because it obviously started out relatively small, could be what Nicola Gentile wrote about in his book, that he brought in Al Capone in 1928 with the power to make 10 men. And Al Capone would have been a capo regime, capo di Cina, and he could have done this with others. Rocco Pellegrino, who was a former Camorra boss operating in the greater New York area, would have had a crew of his own already. And there's probably others who had their own crews. So he could have brought in these men who were associated with the family and just made them captains with their own crews. He could have also brought people in without passing the names around, which has been done at other times. We know that this happened with Joe Bonanno later on in the 1950s. So, so those are a couple possibilities how we could have increased it.
If I could expand on something, I'd also like to state that when this breakup happened, you had a sanctioned group and an unsanctioned group. The Morellos, they would not have been sanctioned. Within the world of politics, it would have went to the Luccheses. Had Morello and his company been successfully eliminated, it would have been a three-captain situation where you never really hear about them again. It was just a dispute. Groups are not formed and broken up very easily. There is a political process behind this. And Morello just trying to kill somebody and restate his claim as boss, that is a violation of protocol, and it ran a chiral to what was the established political climate at the time. Salvatore D'Aquila was already holding the top elected position for more than a decade, and he would have won the legal case if this ever went to a court. It does speak to the power and force that Morello and Masseria were able to put together to eventually become recognized and sanctioned by the rest of the world that was there, the other families outside of New York. The interesting thing about the Genoveses and the Luccheses today is they both inherited traits from the Corleonese. This former Corleone Cosca that was in New York City from 1900 to 1920. With the breakup, you see the Genovese family having a strong representation in New York City. And then with the Lucchese family, they have more of a representation in the Bronx, but East Harlem is intermixed. And I would argue that the Lucchese family inherited the Corleonese political affiliations nationwide. You see this in LA with the boss, Jack Dragna, who was Corleonese. I believe his representative or avocat on the commission was Tom Gagliano.
I used to lean more toward the Lucchese family being the natural continuation of the former Morello family because it reflects more of the origins. We see Corleone, the traditional Corleonese clans show up much more heavily in the Lucchese family, spanning decades. They didn't really maintain that way later, but the Luccheses are a topic for another time. We also see Marineo, where you said Loiacano was from, the Di Palermos from Prince Street of the Lucchese family. Their family was from Marineo. We also see Baucina, which is another interior Palermo town. That was part of the original Morello family. Nino Cicala, who was part of the counterfeiting case, he was from Baucina. The Locascios of the Lucchese family were from there, as well as others, I believe. And then, so you can see that some of the original Campesani elements and their related politics continued on in the Lucchese family. We do see those same towns in more of a minority in the Genovese family. And so as a result, though, I used to lean toward, oh, the Lucchese families are the continuation of the Morello family. The Genoveses were more this offshoot that was later recognized as their own thing, like you said. But I think what's changed my opinion somewhat is learning that the Morello family had changed quite a bit throughout the 1910s and 20s while Morello was away. And we're now collecting evidence that they had actually diversified quite a bit. You know, Frankie Yale was mentioned by a Secret Service informant as a Morello, part of the Morello organization. He went on to join Masseria. So it appears the Morellos were bringing in mainlanders before the breakup. They didn't just fill out their ranks with independents like Rocco Pellegrino and others later. It was that this process was already unfolding.
Well, some of the stuff was already addressed, I think, by you just now, Eric. The importance, we talk about the Corleonese family, and I think we got into this a little bit when we were discussing the letter from Joe Morello to Rosario Dispenza, who was the boss in Chicago, and it was signed, of course, we have Corleone, and we were kind of breaking down some of these names, and of course, it's the majority of what we know of as that family's network were men from Corleone, but there was also Angelo Lagatuta, who was from Mezzogiusso, which is another one of these sort of towns. So you say inland Palermo, it's sort of directly inland from the city of Palermo, but not as far inland as Corleone itself, right? But it's adjacent to Corleone. It's kind of in between the city of Palermo and Corleone. This area including Marineo, Baucina, Mezzogiusso, Cefaladiana, which is where later Genovese consigliere Saverio Polaccia, right, was from. So there seems to at least be a couple people that wound up in the Genovese family. We don't, of course, know who all the members were. Don't have an accurate chart of the membership from early 1920s to 1931. So we can't be definitive about this, right? But when I was interested to kind of go back to Salvatore Loiacano, right, the guy that we were just talking about. Where was he? Corleonese?
Marineo.
Marineo. That's okay. Yeah, I thought so. Okay. And he was backed by D'Aguila, who was a Palermitan boss. It's interesting. It's kind of, right. It's the areas in between Palermo and Corleone, right?
One thing I want to say, just we got to kind of correct hold a little bit of caution. There is no evidence that Locoino or Logiacano knew D'Aquila. We have no evidence of these two ever meeting, ever having a picture taken. All we know is that after Locoino was killed, this is when D'Aquila got involved. So we can put two and two together and conclude that D'Aquila did not appreciate an unsanctioned murder occurring, because you can't just take out a boss.
Right.
Yeah, I think we can infer that Loiacano and D'Aquila knew each other, had contact. They're both bosses of major New York
Lived
families.
on the same street.
I didn't know that.
Elizabeth Street. I mean, a couple blocks away from each other, 91 and maybe 256 Elizabeth Street. But
so I don't think, yeah, that's great information. I don't think it's too bold to say they knew each other and that D'Aquila essentially backed Loiacano on a de facto basis. But I think, what you're getting at is we don't know if D'Aquila was particularly friendly with Loiacano. It seems like D'Aquila's problem was more of a concern over Morello. He was disturbed by Morello coming back, the guy who previously held the national capo position. And so it may not have been that he really loved Loiacano and supported him as boss. It may have been more, I really don't want Giuseppe Morello to get power again.
Chances are they knew each other. I mean, it would be impossible for them not to know each other. We just don't want this to turn into something where someone else sees this and then writes down that Morello killed Locoino, who was Salvatore d'Aquila's best friend.
Right.
And staunch ally. We're going outside of things that cannot be confirmed.
Well, Loiacano
I think we might be able to infer it, though, from Flynn's article that he was under Aquila's approval, let's say, as opposed to Fortunato Lamonte, who we know from Gentile's account that he ordered his death, and he also took up the territory. So they end up moving north to the Bronx at that point. So it makes sense. I mean, it fits together.
Well, for the timeline, when exactly was Lamonte killed, and when exactly was Loiacano killed?
Lamonte's 1914, right?
It was that far back, yeah, yeah. And then Loiacano.
Well, there was Greco in between.
Loiacano is it 1923?
1920.
And then the way that I've seen it explained, and this is, I'm asking this to kind of set it up for you guys because you know more about this this early New York stuff than I do by far. The way that I've seen it explained before was that D'Aquila backed Loiacano. Loiacano got killed. Then Vincenzo Terranova took over that family. This is the account I've seen before, and that there was a dispute between these families, and that Umberto Valenti, who was said to be, I don't know what his rank was, but he was said to be like a lieutenant, quote unquote, whatever that might mean, under D'Aquila, was killed in 1922, and then right after that, Vincenzo Terranova was killed. Right? Would you agree that Terranova took over, or was the family already split by that point?
It might have been split after the death of Locoino, right, and it could have been under Vincenzo Terranova, but that's speculation. I want to make that clear. So it's a theory that we're going by. There's no definitive proof that Vincenzo Terranova was a boss, but it's suspected that he could have been at that point, or it could have just been Morello until Masseria was named as the boss of what is now the Genovese family.
And with that in mind,
I don't subscribe to Vincent Terranova being a boss. The reason being is, at this time, after the death of Locoino, the official sitting boss of the Corleonese family, this split occurred. The guys that were sanctioned as the next leaders would have been the Luccheses. They fell in line with the established political world at the time. Whatever the Morellos were doing, they weren't sanctioned until after a certain point. I know.
I mean, the boss of the Morello faction.
Yeah, I know, but we have to be careful doing that because, we don't want people thinking, okay, this guy's a boss, then anybody can become a boss. There's certain names like, we hear Nick Morello being a boss. We don't have any confirmation of that. We don't really have anything of Tommaso Lamonte, who was Fortunato's brother, being the boss, and also Tom Greco. These are names that are floated as leaders, but we don't really have any inside sources like Nick Gentile to say that these guys were bosses. And whatever was going on between 1920 and 1924 within the Morello Genovese nucleus, Vincent Terranova was probably an on-the-street leader of a faction, but his ranks wouldn't have been secured. Just like, during the Casta de Morese War, during the changeover, guys did not just step up and claim a position. They had to go through a formal process, and Vincent Terranova was in no position to go through a formal process. If we want to call him a factional leader for the Morellos or something to that effect, we can, but we just got to be very careful because people just don't come out and stake out that they're boss. There's a formal process to it.
Yeah, and with that in mind, there's a tendency for outsider coverage. Your article is exceptional. A few other sources or a few other writers are exceptional, but there's a tendency with this subject to say, oh, Morello went to prison, it was taken over by his brothers. So and so died, it was taken over by his brother. It makes me think of the Godfather video game where it's like a guy dies, and the son takes over. His son's the underboss. And that happens on occasion, but it's very rare. And even though these clan connections, even though blood relation and kinship played a pivotal role, it wasn't what defined someone's status and authority as the boss. They may, like you said, they may have been a factional representative, they may have been a representative of their clan, which directly informed the politics of the organization. And I want to jump forward just a little bit and say the same is true for Giuseppe Morello, because I think one of the reasons why there's a tendency to say that the Genovese family is the direct heir of the Morello family is because Giuseppe Morello was once boss of the Morello family, as we call it. They wouldn't have called it the Morello family, but I mean, we know some sources did, but it was out of convenience. It was really a broader family than that. And just because Giuseppe Morello continued on in the Genovese family doesn't mean that that was the continuation. That's like saying the Tucson family, which was never recognized, was the true succession of the Bonanno family because Joe Bonanno went there and ran his own de facto group when he was deposed. So we can't see this just in terms of the Morello Terranova brothers. This was far more complex than that. And I think you're right to not assume that Nick Morello, who was killed in 1915, 16, to not see him and Vincenzo Terranova as or just not to assume that they were bosses just because they were Morello's brothers.
Well, I have to respond to that because it's mentioned in our article, but we're very clear that it's speculation. So this is in there as a possibility. We explore different possibilities of what could have taken place, and that's one of them. There is, the evidence for that time period is very hard to come by, direct evidence. So we have to kind of go by suggestions, and there is, and there are some articles that suggest that Terranova had some sort of leadership position, but that's newspaper journalist speculation. So, we're soft on that. We're not making any hard claims to him, just allowing it as a possibility. And it is a possibility. He could have been the representative of that faction. And as far as Greco is concerned, I believe it was in the court transcript of the Bernard Baff case that he was involved with, and it said that he was the leader. So I think that it is a stronger piece of evidence because that's during testimony.
Yeah, we don't have.
So,
sorry, Rick.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I mean, just to clarify, from my understanding, if we're talking about 1922, when I floated that as a prompt to get this sort of discussion because just the sort of research I focused on for early Chicago is rife with unsupported myths and claims and all sorts of assertions of secession and who had what formal position and that sort of thing that's really not based in any sort of solid evidence, right? And a lot of it, I think, I would imagine for this period in New York is also based on newspaper accounts, right? Sometimes the newspapers had their own sources. Sometimes they were getting this from the police. The police had sources. Some of it could be correct. Some of it could be wrong, right? All of it could be correct. All of it could be wrong. We don't really know. So unlike the case with Greco, where there's some court documents to support that, right? Or unlike when we had Flynn and the Secret Service investigating some of these people, there isn't really an equivalent that I know of for 1922. And Nicola Gentile doesn't tell us what Terranova's position was, right? Do we know that Umberto Valenti, for example, that he was a member of what we call the Gambino family for a fact? Do we know his position?
Yeah, Valenti, Gentile was as close as that was one of his best friends. And he makes it very clear, Valenti was apparently sympathetic with the Morello faction to some degree, I believe. But I just want to point out real quick, because I don't think it was mentioned, the Greco that you guys are referring to is Ippolito Greco, who ran a saloon that was one of the main hangouts. It was essentially a headquarters for the Morello family when he was alive, and there's strong evidence he was a leader. I believe he was Corleonese, if I'm not
Yes.
mistaken. Okay, but I want to add something too that you know I mentioned a few minutes ago how the Morello family had changed quite a bit since 1909 when or 1910, whenever it was, Giuseppe Morello was arrested and went to prison. And we see that Nick Morello, he's killed during what's believed to be a war between a New York Camorra group and the Morello family. And I believe a guy killed with him, is it Ubriaco?
Ubriaco.
Ubriaco.
Yeah.
Ubriaco.
Calabrese.
Yeah, he's a
Yeah, Eugene
Calabrese.
Ubriaco.
Yep.
So I mean, that's around the mid 1910s, and this is the period we see in other cities like Pittsburgh, for example. Gentile talked about it. In the late 1910s, they started bringing in Calabrians who had their own independent group. There was some kind of conflict, somewhat mythologized by Gentile, but the basics of what ended up happening are accurate. That in the 1910s, Cosa Nostra, probably across the entire country, some families less so or not at all, begin bringing in mainlanders. So we see Nick Morello is very close to a Calabrian. He's killed with him. He could have been a member by then. We see Frankie Yale gets identified as a Morello member or part of the Morello organization. I believe it wasn't Salvatore Clemente, but it was the other Secret Service source who had a lot of good info. He specifically says Frankie Yale was with the Morello organization. And we can presume, based on his stature, that Frankie Yale probably would have been that first wave of mainland recruits. And even though all of these clan connections we talk about are significant, it informed the politics, it informed the formation of Cosa Nostra, the development, criminal relationships, business relationships are a big part of this too. And so, no doubt that was part of this induction of non-traditional members. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, Gentile.
Yeah, I think, I'm sorry. I just want to follow up on that a little bit and then I'll let you go. I think Frankie Yale is first mentioned in as being connected with Masseria, along with Frankie Marlowe. There's an entry in the Secret Service Daily Report of Agents for 1921. So we
Yeah,
don't know if they were connected earlier. They could very well have been. We do know that he was connected with Al Capone earlier, though. There's articles about that. They actually played together on a baseball team.
Wow. Yeah, and I want to add too that I think what you're referring to, maybe there's other information, but you mentioned in your article how 1921, 1922, there was a counterfeiting investigation into Joe Masseria, and one of his partners was a Calabrian referred to as Frank Aiello, which to me is clearly a reference to Yale. His
I
original
agree.
name, his original name phonetically sounds almost identical to Aiello. Uh, and so that's when Giuseppe Morello, he's obviously involved in criminal activity. You mentioned, because this is a good chance to kind of bridge into Masseria, because there's all these relationships, the Morello family's diversifying, but suddenly this conflict happens and Joe Masseria rises as a boss seemingly out of nowhere, even though he was a known criminal quantity with relationships in the underworld. He really does come out of nowhere as one of the major political figures in New York's mafia political headquarters. And I want to mention too, Tony mentioned Lagatuda earlier, who was apparently Morello's compare, and Masseria's brother Salvatore married a Lagatuda who came from the same hometown. Later moved to Cleveland, where the Masserias were involved. One of Masseria's brothers was part of the Cleveland family mentioned by Gentile. So it appears Masseria's family did have some kind of connection to the mafia. We don't know if that went back to Sicily, but he's not a major factor until he becomes boss. Do you guys have any thoughts on where did Masseria come from? Why did he become so important? Who was he, for that matter?
Yeah, I'd like to answer that question. We'll bring it back to his father. His father, Giuseppe Masseria Sr., was born in Marsala and apparently moved to Menfi in Agrigento. So Marsala in Trapani. And and there's actually two towns named Menfi. There's one in Trapani as well, but I think it's one in Agrigento because that's close to Shaka, which Nick Gentile mentions in his writings. And he was apparently a wealthy landowner. Uh, I was able to get in contact with relatives and who gave me some background on him. So Masseria, the name Masseria itself means farmhouse, and in fact, he did have a farm that he sold before he came to America in 1898. And Giuseppe Jr., Joe Masseria, came in 1902, and along with his mother, I believe it was Vitina Marcheca. And so he managed to learn to speak English very well, and he worked different jobs. He worked as a saloon keeper, bartender, as well as an ice dealer. He was only about 5'4", 5'3.5", so kind of close in size to D'Aquila. Contrary to what Joe Bonanno says, Joe Bonanno creates a myth about their size difference, about their weight difference, and he makes him out to be a fat slob. And he was about 148 pounds, contrasted to Salvatore Maranzano, who was 218 pounds at their deaths. So, yeah, so quite a difference. So technically, Maranzano was obese, and Masseria was just overweight. So, anyways,
just want to add,
go ahead.
There's that bizarre passage in Joe Bonanno's book where he goes on about Masseria's eating habits, which
Yeah,
Joe Bonanno met him once, maybe he met him a few times, but he only mentions this one meeting with Maranzano and Morello as the Castellamarese War was building. But there's this entire paragraph about how Masseria just was such a glutton, and I think he closes it saying something like, Maranzano felt Masseria would just keep getting fatter and fatter and crazier and crazier. Obviously he was his enemy, but it's still just such a funny, unnecessary little passage.
yeah. As opposed to how we describe Maranzano as muscular, and according to the coroner's report, he was far from muscular.
Jumping up on at meetings and so forth, unless he had gained a lot of weight in the interim, I find that hard to imagine.
Because he could kill somebody with his pinkies.
That's right.
Maranzano could leap tall buildings and kill someone with his pinkies.
Yeah.
Right. Leap tall buildings in a single bound.
The fixation on his eating habits and sort of the idea that he was, I think that's kind of been translated into the popular media also. I forget which movie it was that kind of showed Joe the boss, like this sweating, sort of vile, kind of gluttonous person, fat, shoveling with pasta into his mouth. I think there was some movie at some point that depicted him in that way. That's part of that is also sort of a cultural idiom of depicting him as being, he's gluttonous, he can't control himself. His hunger, it's not literal hunger, it's sort of a figurative hunger to take over rackets, to take over power, right? So it's not surprising actually that Bonanno would characterize him that way. He might have really at that point remembered him that way, even if it wasn't factual, because from the point of view of Maranzano, group, the Castellamarese group that were later on at war with Masseria's, him and his allies, that's how I'm sure how they understood him, right? I mean, he was trying to take over everything, right? He was, right? That's a form of gluttony. It's a form of greed.
And I want to add too that there were people who liked him. We mostly hear from his enemies like Joe Bonanno and to some degree Joe Valachi, who was part of Maranzano's faction. Nicola Gentile was sympathetic with Masseria during the Castellamarese War. And Rick mentioned Shaka. Joe Masseria, I believe Joe the boss, I thought he was born in Menfi, but he was living in his mother's hometown of Marsala on the Trapani coast before he came to the U.S. And it is interesting that Gentile refers to Masseria as a Shakatano, because that draws more from the Menfi side. And we don't know of any Shakatan who joined the Genovese family later. There may have been, they're all over. I mean, Shaka is one of those places, just anywhere Shaka is, there's typically a Cosa Nostra presence, any colony where it shows up in the US. But they don't show up in the Genovese family that we know of. The Gambino family had the most significant faction from there. It shows up in the Bonanos and some other families. But it is interesting that Gentile calls Masseria's faction the Shakatan. And that's not insignificant, because Gentile himself was sort of a de facto Shakatan coming from the Agrigento coast. And so he saw Masseria that way. With his heritage, though, you mentioned that he had some criminal associates who were the Ruffinos, who were connected to the Bonanno family. And Masseria's heritage in Trapani is more linked to the Bonannos. But I forgot to mention that in addition to his brother marrying a Lagatuda from Mezzoiuso, like Morello's compare, one of Morello's criminal associates in the 1910s was also a Pietro Lagatuda, and he looks to come from Mezzoiuso as well. That could tell us he had some kind of relationship between his brother's marriage that decade and his criminal association with Pietro Lagatuda. It could tell us that his Morello connections didn't come out of nowhere, even though we can't place him as a member of that family at the time.
Yeah, and it's interesting, following up on, you mentioned Rufino, and that was the 1913 burglary case where we really hear about Masseria. And they were part of a burglary crew that was pretty sophisticated, the way they entered into a pawn shop. And they were caught in the act. And Masseria's partner in that was Joseph Rufino. And Rufino married the daughter of Sebastiano di Gaetano, who was the boss of the Bonanos before Colaschiro. So that's a very strong association. So we can't say that Masseria himself was a member of the Bonanos, but he might very well, at the least, have been an associate of that group. And that wouldn't be surprising considering the Good Killers link that I mentioned earlier.
That was the 1913 pinch for burglary. That's where they were cutting a hole through the wall, I believe, of a pawn shop, or through the roof, and they were spotted by a street patrolman, I think, right?
Right.
Yeah. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Masseria also was pinched in 1909 for a burglary. I recall seeing that when I was looking through one of the New York papers. If I'm wrong, don't quote me on that. But that, and I don't think, I think his sentence was either commuted or dropped for that. But I think he was sentenced to prison for the 1913 one. Is that correct?
Yeah, I went to Sing Sing.
Right. How long was he in Sing Sing?
He got out in 1916, so just about 3 years.
Well, and then right. So we don't know if before that, if he was affiliated at all with the Morello family. We don't know if that happened in prison, right? Or if it happened after he got out of prison. There's no indication when he first became affiliated, and no idea when he. We know he would have been made by the time he was a boss, right? But
I want to get into that. It'd be a good chance to bring Angelo into this, because I got this information from him. But Angelo, didn't one of the Secret Service informants from the era indicate that Masseria was only recently an inducted member in the years before he became boss?
Yes, but it's an ambiguous passage. The informant, De Matteo, he was providing information, and he seemed to have some knowledge of what was going on. However, the SS did not always ask the right questions. What he said, or what he identified, was that D'Aquila was head of what he called the Fratellanza, and the Fratellanza was composed of 2,000 to 3,000, quote, Sicilian Camorrists. That probably wasn't his terminology, but that's how it was written up. In 1923, he specifically says that Masseria is not a member of the Fratellanza. Then later on, he says that, in 1923, he says that Masseria was, quote, now a member of the Fratellanza. 1923 is cutting it pretty late. Gentile identified him as a boss in 1921. There are no sources of him being significant prior to 1921, but as we've all kind of articulated, he didn't just come out of a vacuum.
Yeah, and with that in mind, I think, people don't quite understand this because it's not obvious. We think of somebody becoming boss and that they've put their time in, they've been a member for years. That's often the case. But throughout the entire history of Cosa Nostra, guys get made and rise up very quickly. Rick mentioned Al Capone was inducted. According to Gentile and Algie Maniaci of Milwaukee, who knew former Chicago members, knew members who were in Chicago at the time, as well as later Chicago members, they both said Al Capone was immediately promoted to Capodicina. We know Joe Bonanno was made probably around 1929. He was a captain by the following year with Maranzano's faction. And then Joe Bonanno becomes boss. So he's maybe made for 2-3 years at the most. Many years later in the 90s, Ralph Natali in Philadelphia, he gets made by a soldier, apparently, Joey Merlino, and then he becomes boss possibly that same day, I guess. And people look at that and they roll their eyes, which in that case, Philadelphia was in disarray. And that might be an extreme example, a guy becoming boss the same day he's made. That's crazy. But still, there's a long history of guys getting made, and they're already seen as capable, which is why they're made. And then their promotion really isn't that big of a deal. Some guys might resent it. I've seen many examples in various families where guys resent a boss not having tenure, but there's no rule against it. It's no violation of mafia protocol. And even though Masseria might not have been made until late, it does appear his family was a mafia clan of some kind. They were part of the Cleveland family. They're in New York. This may go back to Sicily. He's also forming extensive criminal relationships. I'm sure the prison time helped with that. He's getting close to mainlanders. He's working with Frankie Yale by the early 20s. And so I don't think it's crazy at all to think he might not have been made until later. I think you're right, though, to be conservative about that statement. It's one vague anecdote. And, he's not a member of the Fratellanza. All of a sudden he is. I would take that to mean he's not a member, and then he's made. But, there could be different dynamics at play in that statement. We don't know positively what it meant.
If I could just jump in about this point, is that by Fratellanza, maybe the informant just meant recognition by D'Aquila.
Yeah.
It's hard to say. I don't know if it was the same informant that said that Tony Lombardo later in Chicago, because we know he didn't become boss until after 1924. But this was, I don't know if this was before he was boss. I forget the exact year that one of those Secret Service informants said they described Tony Lombardo as a member of the Fratellanza in Chicago. So they're clearly indicating this is the mafia as a whole, not just the D'Aquila family, the Gambino family.
Real quick, yeah. Fratellanza was a term for Cosa Nostra back in Sicily, in Favara, Agrigento. I believe it was the prefect Mori, and before he was in full power under Mussolini. I believe he investigated the Favara family, which was referred to as the Fratellanza. It showed up in some other community in Sicily as well. So that was a term that came from Sicily and referred to the mafia as a whole.
Yeah, but this informant, it's unclear. There's a possibility that he could be using it specifically to refer to the D'Aquila family. But then that would be odd then, because then apparently he must have thought, if that was the case, when he first says that Masseria is not a member of the Fratellanza, and then he later on in the same year says now he is a member of the Fratellanza, either he's referring to the mafia as a whole, or he's referring to the D'Aquila family, but he thinks that in 1923, Masseria became a member of the D'Aquila family. You see?
Two things.
Yeah.
According to informant Salvatore Calderone in Sicily, he said that anyone who's good enough to become a member is good enough to become a boss. This is a rule, or this is a belief that's part of their organization, so guys can move up very quickly. Another thing about informant De Matteo, there was another quote that came out around the time he was informing that identified Frank Yale as a quote, direct lieutenant of Ignazio Lupo. Lupo was the former boss of the Gambino family. The problem with that, though, is Yale would have been probably in his young teens when Lupo went to prison in the 1910s. He was way too young to be a direct lieutenant, especially for a guy who spent the last decade in prison. So we don't really know what to make of that. There are some weird statements that are made. You recognize it, you try to verify it, but there's some things. And, this goes into modern day. Like even in the 1960s, you had informants saying that Gambino had 75 Capodicine. I mean, you do have people that say weird stuff because this stuff isn't written down. This is what people see and observe. Sometimes things get misconstrued. The agents could have written down something the wrong way.
Yeah, well, just following up on what you said, you pointed out that Nick Gentile said that Masseria was a boss in 1921. Now, he couldn't have just been made into the mafia, to the fratellanza as a whole, as we understand it, in 1923, and yet be a boss in 1921. That doesn't fit. That doesn't make any sense. So that's
Yeah.
why I threw out that alternative meeting that he might have meant recognized by D'Aquila, because during that other meeting with Lupo and Morello, he did give Lupo recognition. He accepted him back into the fold, but he didn't accept Morello.
If I could real quick, what exactly? I haven't looked at the actual text of Gentile's book memoir Vito de Capo Mafia in a while, so I don't remember exactly what he said about Masseria in 1921. He said he was a boss. Did he describe the family that he was a boss of? Because then that gets back to the whole Terranova thing, right? Unless there was a split and Terranova was the boss of the Lucchese family, right? That wouldn't be consistent with Gentile, and that's a primary source for us, right?
Two things I want to point out with that in mind is that if Masseria was, which he and Morello were part of a rebel faction, as Angelo indicated, they weren't recognized initially by the national governing bodies, which we know was a very strict formal system, just like the commission later. These earlier governing bodies, the Capo, the Grand Concilio, these assembly, the Grand General Assembly meetings, that they would ratify a new boss. It's possible, though, that Masseria was head of a de facto group. For one, we see the Gallo brothers in the early 1960s. They try to break off and rebel against the Colombo leadership. They start trying to make their own guys who are not recognized, and that's similar to actually what happened with Maranzano and Gagliano. When the Castellamarese War broke out, Valachi actually said, I think it's in his manuscript, but he says the Gagliano faction was a very small minority of what became the Lucchese family. So neither Maranzano or Gagliano were probably official bosses in the eyes of the national governing bodies. Joe Bonanno said Maranzano became the boss of the Bonanno family after Shiro stepped down in 1930, but that may have just been internal to the Bonanno family and not something that was widely recognized. So it's possible Masseria was a boss of some kind, quote unquote boss, not the official representante, but it's possible he was a boss.
You just brought up Galliano, right? And this is interesting because a little bit earlier in our conversation, Angelo just sort of noted when we we're talking about Terranova and the 1922 thing, that around that point is when he said, if it wasn't Terranova, it would have been the Lucchese family or something, right? And I think I just wanted to sort of stop and go back to that. We've talked a lot about Masseria, who's a very important figure because he goes on to become boss of bosses, and we know his role during the Castellamarese War. But if we think it's reasonable to put bounds around Masseria becoming boss of what we call the Genovese family sometime between 1921 and 1923, does that seem to be the range that we're talking about? With
Absolutely.
de facto versus official recognition, right? But then my understanding is it was Gaetano Reina that was the initial boss of what we call the Lucchese family, and the Galliano took over later. And do we know what Gaetano Reina's position was in that same range of time between 1921 and 1923? I don't recall offhand if Gentili mentions him, right? Gentili says that Masseria is a boss in 1921. Does he mention Reina during his years at all?
I don't
No, he
believe so.
doesn't. We don't know that he's a boss until he's killed in 1930.
Right. And then Galliano takes over at that, or Pinzolo takes over for a short period of time, right? And then, yeah, and he's killed, what, 5 months after Reina's killed in 1930? I always picture him when he has those
something like that.
bandages. Yeah, the picture we have of him with his ears bandaged up.
One thing I want to point out real quick, I'd have to look back at what Gentile actually says, but something to keep in mind too is that virtually every source, there's a margin of error when they give years and dates. You know, we all know this, but it should be stated that guys don't even remember the exact year they were inducted. I know a very well-known Colombo member insists he was made in, I believe, 1975, but another guy in the same ceremony cooperated and says it was 78. And some of the information this guy gave for his induction ceremony in 75, based on who was holding what positions, clearly indicates it was actually 78. So there's always, and we see that later, guys will say, oh, this happened in 1932, this happened in 1934. We look at the actual evidence and it was 1930, it was 1938. You know, these guys are often recalling things decades later. And even though Gentile had an incredible memory, he was remembering the volatile events of the early 20s decades later in another country. So while his information is important, we can't assume that whatever he says about Masseria taking over is the exact time that it happened. It seems like Gentile was even mistaken about some of his own travels and dates as well in his own life.
In his book, Gentile talks about that Morello and Lupo and Valenti and others were given the death penalty by D'Aquila, and that they traveled to Sicily, and while they were there in Sicily, that they consulted with Nick Gentile, who was already there. But when you look at actual passenger manifests that are available on sites like Ancestry.com or Family Search, you'll see that Gentile had returned to the United States before the others left. He was in this country when they left, and so he'd already returned and was going about his routine with Boston and Pittsburgh, while the other guys got to Sicily. And it's very possible that while they were there, they conferred with Salvatore Maranzano, who was, according to Allegra, the provincial boss of Trapani, and who held court in Palermo. So that's a big catch right there. I think his general story is correct, but like you said, dates can be way off for these people. So that's why we have to fact check them.
Yeah, we do know that. Well, I want to go back to something Angelo mentioned a minute ago about the Secret Service informant who linked Frankie Yale to Ignazio Lupo. And as Angelo mentioned, Frankie Yale, even though some of these guys were made in their teens, we have numerous sources that indicate inductions were very early, but still, Frankie Yale was way too young to have been an actual member of Lupo's family, what we now call the Gambinos. It doesn't mean he wasn't maybe getting involved in crime and forming relationships. But that Secret Service informant who said he had been a lieutenant of Lupo, one interpretation is that he wasn't active when Lupo was on the streets, when mainlanders probably weren't even being made, first decade of the 20th century. It could indicate, though, Yale was made into the Gambino family, and the informant just meant that he was involved. He was a lieutenant in Lupo's organization. We know transfers could happen. Yale, if he was made into the Morello family, he did transfer technically to the Genovese family. That's one interpretation. And we know from our buddy Michael Di Leonardo that he was told on the streets of Brooklyn that Yale had been very close to D'Aquila. So, of course, Yale had relationships to all kinds of different guys, but just calling someone a quote unquote lieutenant, which is a very vague term, could mean anything. And as Angelo said, there's no reason to think a very young Frankie Yale was a member when Lupo was the boss. But it could indicate there was something there. It just might not be formal.
Yeah, it might not mean. I mean, that's the way I've thought about it too. Is it? I mean, it could be an informal relationship, but the Dagwala thing could point to there having been a formal affiliation at some point, or it could just point to all of these guys being important and respected individuals within the mob in Brooklyn, right? And the Lupo thing could be a reference. I mean, obviously, it can't be a reference to him being a kid and being a captain under Lupo, but I mean, the informant could be using the Lupo family and the way that we're using Gambino family to refer to an organization when Carlo Gambino died in the 70s, right? So it's hard to say, right?
Jumping ahead, we don't need to focus on this period so much, but I do want to point out that Yale is killed earlier the same year that D'Aquila is killed. And we don't really have, I don't know of any inside source who specifically says why Yale was killed. He may have had sympathies with D'Aquila, and even though he was part of Masseria's family, a captain, Joe Bonanno specifically says Frankie Yale was a group leader, which is his translation of Capodicina. But still, Yale's death could have been related to some kind of political alliance he had with D'Aquila. And, we don't really know what the specifics of that are.
Well, Gentili, I believe, specifically called Frankie Yale a Masseria and Capodicina, did you not?
Joe Bonanno definitely did. Maybe
Gentili.
Yeah, Gentili didn't mention him.
Yeah,
that I recall.
I mean, we've talked to Michael DiLeonardo off the air about this, right? Because I mean, obviously, Frankie Yale was a name that people still remembered when Michael was coming up on the streets, right? This is Brooklyn, right? I mean, Yale got killed right there. I actually used to live a couple blocks away from there in Borough Park. He got killed. I mean, and he was also based in that area as well as around the Brooklyn waterfront area, right? So, I mean, those roots go really far back in Brooklyn. And one of the things is that, whether or not he was formally ever with the Lupo Dagwala family, it's possible as things were ramping up, and it's clear that Masseria in 1928 is really gearing up to finally kind of challenge Dagwala for the boss of bosses position. Dagwala gets killed later that year, as Eric already mentioned. In the summer, I believe in either June or July, Frankie Yale is killed. This is the same year that Masseria makes Capone a Capodicina when he makes him. We don't know if he was replacing Frankie Yale because Frankie Yale had been a captain. We don't really know exactly when in that year Capone was made, but we're told by Gentili that the condition upon which Masseria inducted Capone into the mafia was that he would take out Tony Lombardo, the boss of Chicago, and Giuseppe Aiello, the underboss of Chicago. So clearly, Masseria was aiming to install Capone as boss. We know he tried to do similar things with sort of potential client bosses in Detroit, with Chester Lamare, as well as in Cleveland, right? And, the way I kind of see it is he was sort of trying to set up dominoes in place to kind of, Maranzano does this later on. Maranzano makes Capone boss of Chicago in exchange for Capone recognizing him as boss of bosses, right? It's, it's these people aren't just, sort of warlords that come in and take over. They at least need to have the formal recognition of other bosses, including important bosses of important families, to install them and to ratify their position as the head of the Grand Council, right? And it's possible that, if Lombardo may have been a supporter of Dagwala, and that's why, Masseria wants him out. He wants one of his guys in. If Yale was friendly with Dagwala, he might have seen him as being suspect. I think we floated that idea to Michael DiLeonardo. We don't know. It's complete speculation, but it's what Michael said is that's exactly how it would work if that were the case.
And, the mention of...
and something else, also, there's articles that came out when Yale and D'Aquila were killed, and they happened to mention that D'Aquila had lived on Bath Beach in Brooklyn, not far from where Yale was.
Right.
And the articles mentioned that they knew each other. In fact, they thought that D'Aquila was a lieutenant of Yale's.
Yeah. Well, it's like how they thought Lombardo was a lieutenant of Capone in Chicago, you know?
And this
Yeah.
reference to Capone and Yale, it goes
Yeah.
back to what, and this plays into the idea that some people thought Masseria might have been a boss earlier than he actually was. Because what Joe Bonanno says in his book is that Capone went to Chicago in the 1920s with Frankie Yale's explicit blessing, but he says, Joe Bonanno says, it can be presumed that it also had Masseria's blessing. That doesn't fit the timeline because Capone goes to Chicago around what, 1919, 1920 at the latest.
1919.
And, yeah. So, Frankie Yale is apparently already with the Morello organization. Joe Masseria is not in the picture as a boss yet. So Masseria would have had no authority over Yale at that time. And Joe Bonanno's assumption that Masseria gave his blessing to Capone going there, that's an assumption. And I don't blame Bonanno because he wasn't even in the US then. And his description of the relationship between Capone, Yale, and Masseria is accurate for the era when Joe Bonanno came to New York. We know from Gentile, Maniaci, virtually every source with knowledge that Al Capone was an associate of what's now called the Genovese family. Yale was he was possibly an associate on record with Yale. I think that's the easiest thing to deduce. But it's interesting because it means Capone may have actually technically been on record with Yale when he was still with the Morello family.
Yeah, if he was a Morello that early, that part we don't know.
Yep.
And but I don't see any indication to suggest that Yale was any way connected with Lupo. I mean, there's just nothing there.
Aguila, yes, but Lupo, no.
Correct. And was D'Aquila later on? I mean, in the mid 1920s, after we know he was already connected with Masseria.
Yep.
With Lupo in mind, he's part of these events. The Morello family, when the Morello family is at war, when Giuseppe Morello is released from prison, Lupo's involved with these events. But as you mentioned, Lupo has his death sentence reversed by D'Aquila. And you guys determined in your article that Lupo was boss of what's now the Gambino family, even though he was Morello's brother-in-law. And outsiders typically try to say he was a lieutenant of his brother-in-law, Morello. But it tells you a lot about the politics that were at play, that Lupo had a death sentence on him, just like Morello and the Terranovas. But Lupo was able to petition, apparently, the Sicilian mafia because he came back in 1923 from Sicily with Manfredi Minio's brother-in-law, Nino Grillo, who was a boss of a Palermo family. So it looks like in addition to his own Palermo heritage leading him to be the boss of his own family separate from Morello, it looks like he utilized his own connections, which overlap with D'Aquila. D'Aquila was a close friend of Nino Grillo. It looks like he petitioned his own contacts, his own relationships to get his death sentence reversed. And we know from Clemente that Lupo was reinstated. Because what D'Aquila did is he shelved these guys. In addition to putting a contract on him, he shelved them. And Clemente said that Lupo is reinstated in 1923. Later that year, a banquet is held in Lupo's honor, which interestingly was attended by some Calabrians. But Lupo doesn't, he seems to have made peace with D'Aquila, at least on the surface, and he kind of escapes these events a little bit. After that, he doesn't join, to our knowledge, Morello and the Genovese family, Masseria's family. But he seems to have had his own separate political relationships, whereas Morello had his own and didn't get his death sentence lifted until after Lupo.
24.
Yeah, so during that time period, they were dropping bodies all over the place, and so I theorized that maybe Masseria was made boss, so that Morello could join the fold, that he would never be a boss again, but he would kind of be as Bonanno said, the brains behind Masseria.
He said he was the chief advisor. That would lend itself to conciliary, but I don't think we have anybody who says definitively. Which brings up another guy who's part of this. What's up?
Polacchia. He was considered Masseria's consiglio. How early that was, we don't know.
Yeah,
We can just
that's kind of
assume.
a question I have because we know that Saverio Palacia goes to Chicago with Frankie Yale in the 20s. Palacia is obviously heavily involved with. He's probably a leader of some kind. Gentile says he's consigliere as of 1932, and this apparently went back to when Masseria was alive. What's not clear to me is when, like you said, when he got the position, because Morello's killed in August of 1930, I believe, and it's possible Palacia became consigliere then. We also don't know if he held the position earlier, but his family was from that same interior of Palermo, and he seems to have been one of the guys.
Cepaladiana. Yeah.
I think it's Cefala
Yeah,
Diana.
Cepaladiana, which is close to Mezzogiuso. It's in that same area.
It's the
It's essentially across the Picuzza forest from Corleone itself. So it's we can imagine it was part of the Corleone hinterland.
And so an important part of this that I think we should get into before we end it is some of these guys who come to power in the 1920s and early 30s. You guys mentioned Rocco Pellegrino, who was identified with his own mainland organization prior to becoming a Genovese captain. Vito Genovese is also mentioned by a source as coming from his own mainland network, possibly being a member of a Neapolitan group distinct from, Cosa Nostra. And there's a reference on the DeCarlo tapes to Masseria sneaking guys in the 1920s, including Vito. So Vito may have been like Capone in that he was somewhat of an independent with his own identity, who was then brought in and given immediate stature. Luciano's another, not from the mainland. He's actually from this same part of interior Palermo that factored into the Morellos and Genovese, the early Genovese. But Luciano is identified by Bonanno as a captain before Masseria's death. So these guys, they took over the family. But these guys were recruited by Masseria. Frank Costello is another. Megadino referred to on one of his tapes to knowing Costello before he was even made. So he's probably made, who knows when that is. Megadino lived in New York until I believe the early 20s, 1921, 22. So these guys, they were a known quantity there, but they first get their status in the mafia under Masseria.
Luciano was said by one informant to have been made in 1917. His membership may have predated Masseria's. We can't. Again, this is very hard to nail down and confirm. I can just say what some informants have said. I have no argument either way.
Yeah, the quality of the informants wasn't always the best.
And I think just to sort of piggyback off of Eric, we've talked about this not on the show, right? But these are things that have been sort of in the air that we've discussed for a long time. We know from Gentile that when Capone is made, he's elevated to Capo di Cina, and he's given the authority to make 10 men in his own Cina, his own crew. It's not that there's an existing crew. He's made an appointed captain of that crew. It's essentially a whole new unit of the families being created, right?
Yeah.
If it's the case that it's possible that this was a practice Masseria was doing. Maybe he was doing that with Vito Genovese. Maybe he did it with Lucky Luciano. Maybe he did it with Frank Costello. Maybe he did it with Rocco Pellegrino, right? These are guys who also, like Capone, probably before they're in the mafia, they're already part of an important. The reason why they get brought in is because there's somebody already. They're not nobodies who work their way up as lackeys, getting somebody coffee and Bialys or something from the deli. These are guys that, as we know, Capone was already the head of an organization that had been bequeathed to him by Johnny Torrio, several years before he was made into the mafia, right? We know that Rocco Pellegrino was the head of an organization in White Plains, right, in Westchester County. Lucky Luciano, right, may have had a longer trajectory in the mafia, but he was also part of a network that included, Jewish racketeers like Meyer Lansky. Those guys couldn't get made into the mafia, right, but they were an important part of the network that was brought in. So this could be a way that Masseria was filling the ranks of the family up quickly. Maybe this was seen by people like Bonanno as him being greedy, eating, swelling, getting bigger and fatter, right? This could be part of that metaphor,
the thing
right?
is, too, another part of this is that these mainland guys didn't exist in a vacuum before they were made into the mafia. They had
Yep.
relationships already. We see this with the Morellos, likely the Gambinos
Yep.
in the 1910s. We know the Luccheses started inducting mainlanders in the 1920s. Valachi's sponsor, Petrilli, he was a mainlander who was already of some importance, possibly a captain. He doesn't say, but he's one of the leaders, specifically the top leaders of the rebel Gagliano faction. But these guys didn't exist in a vacuum. They were already forming relationships. And we know that Willie Moretti, who's an important part of this conversation,
Another one. Yep.
he's living in Buffalo for, I think, up until some point in the 1920s, where he was at least an associate of the Castello Moraes in Niagara Falls. He formed close relationships to Magadino. On a Magadino tape, he says that Magadino says his own brother actually taught Moretti how to speak Italian. And he's also close to Paolo Palmieri, who later moves to New Jersey, and his children intermarry with Moretti's children. And so Moretti, though, he ends up in New Jersey, where he's not a member of the Newark family. He's a Masseria leader. He's a captain. He's identified as a captain by the time Luciano takes over. But Moretti's already associated with the mafia. We know from the DeCarlo tapes, he had his own roots in a mainland network, mainland organization of some kind. But Moretti's the kind who comes in, or a guy who comes in, and he seems to have already been fully accepted by Cosa Nostra figures. We don't know if he was already made in Buffalo and transferred to Masseria's group, but he's a good example of a guy who was already very involved with Cosa Nostra activity, Cosa Nostra affairs by the time he surfaces in New Jersey.
Yeah, well,
there's some information that Willie Moretti he actually came into New Jersey in the early 1930s, but not in 1930 itself, maybe around 1933. So that comes from some informant in the Kefauver committee material. And I'd like to also relate to something you said, Tony, earlier about Lucky Luciano being associated with Jews. And this is an opportunity to dispel a myth that Joe Masseria didn't associate with Jews, because there's a 1921 report, involving counterfeiting, where his contact was a Jew. And so he clearly did work with Jews and probably other ethnicities as well. And so that's just another myth. There's no truth to it at all.
One thing I want to point out about Moretti, that shouldn't be glossed over at all, what you just said about Masseria already having these relationships to non-Italians. It's not something Luciano, we talked about this in the Luciano episode, but that was already happening with Masseria. He was what Joe Bonanno would be called liberal in the context of the mafia. But I just want to add about Moretti. I've got Richie Boiardo's FBI file, and it says that Moretti was already trying to recruit Boiardo into the mafia around 1930, and Boiardo was a leader with his own independent group. He wanted nothing to do with Cosa Nostra officially, and that when Boiardo went to prison, I believe it was around 1931, but I could be wrong, Moretti actually pulled his associates away and probably put them on record with the Genovese family. We know, though, that Boiardo, even though he was a powerful leader of his own independent organization, he wasn't made until 1943, the FBI learned. Some of Boiardo's associates who had been pulled away from Moretti in the early 30s, like Ray DiCarlo, he wasn't made until, I think, 1944. But, it's possible that what Moretti was doing tells us about what was playing out, in other elements of the Genovese family where, he's trying to pull this guy who's already an important leader in his own right, independently of the mafia. And who knows what would have happened if Boiardo had gotten made that early. We know when he was made later that he's eventually given his own crew made up of guys that had association with him going way back before he was involved in Cosa Nostra. But it looks like they pulled from that element. The difference is Boiardo was disagreeable. Other guys weren't. So that's an important point in this, that these mainlanders, they weren't all of the same mind. Even though there was ethnic tension, these guys had their own relationships, Some of them were more agreeable to the mafia, others weren't. And the guys who joined Masseria were evidently those who were more agreeable.
If I could say something real quick, also, this is interesting because now we're getting into the territory where now we know, yeah, there are mainlanders who are in the what we call the Lucchese families fold, right? But they're at this early point in time, the weight is not shifted towards them. It's still the family is still centered on a leadership and primarily on networks that are Sicilian, primarily Corleonese, and as we know, Angelo said earlier, with the Prince Street crew, which has a long genealogy going back to talking about the old mafia in Lower Manhattan, right? To guys mainly from that area around like Balcina and Marineo and so forth, right? But one thing that's interesting is the sort of different kind of corporate culture, for lack of a better term, and the sort of the networks, right, and how that relates to the identity of a family. Because as we noted, people refer to the Morello family, right? This is more appropriately the the Corleonese family, right? Even though we know not all the members are Corleonese, most of them seem to come from, if they're not from Corleone, they're from the hinterland in internal Palermo, right? We know that the Bonanno family was actually the Castellamarese family, but also had people from the hinterland of it along the border between Palermo and Trapani province, right? As well as some other people from farther afield, right? What becomes the Profaci and Gambino families, right, start out from a group that's dominated by Palermitani, but also includes people from Agrigento and some other places, and a few mainlanders, right, that become involved in it also. But early on, they have these sorts of regional paesani sort of identities, right? Over time, we associate them with the name of a boss, right? It's interesting. So I've discussed this with some of you recently, and this is just to throw this out there because we can't vet the sources. We don't know who the FBI is not providing a list of footnotes or citations, but the FBI in the 1980s presented this at the 25 years after Valachi congressional hearings, but I believe they also presented the same document at a different congressional hearing in the 1980s. So this kind of reflected the FBI's state of the art in terms of their information about the history of the mafia in the U.S. They had the timeline broken down by decades, right? So for the 1930s, under 1931, they state that after Masseria was killed, right, I believe in April of 1931, he's killed, Maranzano takes over. They sort of pay lip service to the idea that there was some sort of fundamental change in the mafia that happened after this. We've talked about this kind of at length. We don't believe that while there was a sort of milestone and some changes that occurred with, especially after Maranzano himself was killed, right? That there's no longer a boss of bosses. The commission carries on the role of the Grand Council, right? But what the FBI states, they're getting it from somewhere. This is probably a synthesis of multiple sources. Some of it could be from Gentili, some of it could be from Bonanno's book, I think, by this point. Some of it could be from informants, maybe some that we haven't seen before, because the FBI did have access to information that we probably haven't read yet, right? And what they say is regional designations were dropped in 1931, and the families took the names of their leaders. Luciano took over the Masseria, and they put in parentheses, Napolitana family, which of course jumped out at me, right? And with Frank Costello as underboss. Joseph Profaci retained control of the Villabate group. And we know that Giuseppe Profaci was from Villabate outside of Palermo, right? Philip Mangano assumed control of the Mineo Palermitana family, right? That before they're recognizing maybe it didn't happen exactly in 1931, right? But at some point, there was an older sort of culture that was in place in the U.S. mafia where these were referred to or thought of more based on their regional paesani core groups. And later on, they're not thought of that. They're referred to by the name of the boss, right? We do see that difference. Maybe it didn't happen all at once in 1931, right? They say Gaetano Galliano became boss of the Reina Siciliani family. So they're marking a distinction here. They're saying the Masseria family, according to whatever source that they're getting this from or synthesizing it from multiple sources, they believe that the Masseria family was called the Napolitana family and that the Reina family was called the Siciliani family. Whether or not that who exactly told them this, if this distinction was in widespread use, we also know it's not 100% accurate because there were obviously Sicilians in the Masseria family. Masseria himself being one, but I mean others, of course, right? We know it does become one of the most heavily non-Sicilian families in terms of membership in the whole country, right? From that point onwards. But there's still plenty of Sicilians even up until recent times, right? And the Reina family, even from early on, did have some mainlanders, and over time, more and more came in, right? But if we wanted to sort of generalize, we probably would say, well, that's if someone told them that, that maybe that reflected some of the thinking, right? But
And
it
that
kind
goes
of
back.
points to this different recruitment network, right?
It goes back to what I was saying earlier too about how like I previously tended to see my view years ago. I remember talking to Angelo about this many years ago when we first got in touch, and my view was that the Masseria group was made up of a few guys from the Morello family, most notably the Morellos themselves, Morello Terranovas, but that they recruited all of these Neapolitans and mainlanders in the 20s. I've revised that view based on the reference to Yale, other evidence that I've dug into, that more likely some of that element already existed in the Morello family. And so that distinction made in the Senate hearing about the Genovese as the Napolitano family and the Luccheses as the Sicilian family, that may have deeper roots. That may not have been, those forced, that view may have been combined into one already under Morello. I want to point out they were mistaken in saying Costello was Luciano's underboss, of
Yeah,
course.
that's why I threw that in there. Yeah, they got some things wrong,
Yeah,
right?
Vito Genovese was the underboss. Bill Bonanno says Costello was the consigliere. Want to point out too, though, that you know during the Castellammarese War, we have Joe Bonanno saying that Maranzano was opposed to Capone in part because he was a Neapolitan and a pimp. That whole narrative. He eventually came to accept him. Turns out when Capone flattered Maranzano's ego, he liked him. We know Maranzano welcomed Joe Valachi into the fold because he was loyal to Maranzano. So even though Maranzano had been a high-ranking mafia leader back in Trapani in Castellammare, we can see that he was very agreeable when a guy stroked his ego and went along with him. But Bonanno goes on a whole tangent in his book in context with this, where Bonanno didn't think he had a very low opinion of the Camorra. He saw them as low-level hoodlums who were totally distinct from his own tradition. And there is strong evidence that the Bonannos inducted very, very few mainlanders before the 1940s or 50s. Same is true for his friend Profaci. The Colombo family doesn't seem to have brought in significant numbers of mainlanders until that era too, 40s or 50s. But the Gambino family did.
Yeah.
And even though guys like Maranzano had this more traditionalist philosophy where they preferred Sicilians who came from mafia clans from Western Sicily, it doesn't appear that's true of D'Aquila. So we can say that the conflict between Morello and Masseria and D'Aquila doesn't seem to have been philosophical. It seems to have been more based around power. Because we see that the Gambinos, for example, started to recruit some very prominent Calabrians from the Brooklyn waterfront. Anastasia became underboss, under Mangano in 1931. You have guys like Carmelo Leconti, Johnny Giustra, probably some Neapolitans. So the Gambino family, as Sicilian as it was, as Palermo and Agrigento heavy as it wasn't opposed to broadening the recruitment base of Cosa Nostra. Bonanno and Colombo families were more conservative. It doesn't seem like, as a whole, the D'Aquila's Gambino family had that same attitude. There might have been factions. There certainly were factions like that, we know, in the Gambino family. But the organization as a whole didn't share that attitude. So funny enough, the D'Aquila family was similar to Masseria's family in that way. And we can see that no known administration members before 1931, at least in New York, were mainlanders. But in 1931, the underboss of both the Gambino and Genovese families were Neapolitans. So that's an interesting aspect of this, that there doesn't seem to have been a philosophical difference related to non-Sicilians between the D'Aquila and Morello Masseria groups.
And to follow up on that story, I'm not quite certain. I think that might have been uh, an alternative designation for the names. There might be some longer history with using the names as the name of the family or Borgata because we could see, for example, like Joe Pravacci's group was called the Villabate family, but prior to Pravacci, it was headed by uh, Salvatore de Bella, who was from Palermo, and it appears to have been Manfredi Mineo's group, who also was from Palermo.
They're both
So
Palermitana families.
yeah,
I think that kind of it's a good point, Rick, because I think sometimes those designations, just like families are referred to historically, they seem to have been referred to based on like whoever the current boss's name was, more or less. Uh, I think that's also true of some of these ethnic descriptions of the families where, Joe Profaci was the boss. His brother-in-law was the underboss. A lot of high-ranking members were from Villabate. So that kind of defined the identity of the family under him, just like the Morello letter that says, "We of Corleone." They were seen as the Corleonese family. Not that every member was from Corleone. And for all we know, maybe when Lucano took over, people saw it as, Marineo family. Who knows? But interestingly, though, when we talked to Frank Fiordolino, he said that on the streets of Bushwick, they referred to the Bonanno family as the Castellamarese family and the Gambinos as the Palermitan, which isn't that exactly what that Senate report said?
The way that they treat the Profaci family, right, in terms of how they actually write it out is different. It's interesting because they'll say Masseria, parentheses, Palermitana family, right? Gaetano Reina, parentheses, Siciliana family, right? Mangano, parentheses, Palermitana family. But then they say the Villabate based family of Joe Profaci. So they might not have, maybe they were just fitting them in with the rest of them. Maybe they hadn't heard a specific term for that family. I don't know. I mean, we will have a show, I think, getting into the sort of the origins of the Colombo family, which might be something a lot of people probably don't know about, right? And there's been some myths around it, I think, also that should be interesting, right? Similar to how we do this one. But it's interesting. At least it seems like somebody must have given them some idea that this is how things were referred to. It's also because you brought up Valachi earlier. So yeah, Maranzano welcomes him into the fold in the context of a war where they're dealing with an organization that had been, I guess in the cultural metaphor, eating everything up like a sandwich, right? Just bringing everything in. And so, yeah, they bring this guy who's, his family's from Avellino. He's an Americanized guy from East Harlem into the fold because they need shooters and muscle, right? After the war ends, he's told basically to go he's transferred to the Genovese family because that's more appropriate for him. So yeah, they welcome him into the fold, but they're like, well, you can, you're part of the thing, right? But it's a Napolitan like you is better off with the Genovese family, right?
I want to point out real quick that Joe Bonanno also, I'm going to add to that, but Joe Bonanno also refers to his family as the Castellamarese family, which, as Angelo and Rick discovered, is not accurate, not entirely accurate of the origins of his family. The first known bosses were a clan from Partinico and specifically Camporeale. At that time, when guys like Paulo Orlando and Shiro were bosses, on the streets, they might have referred to them as the Campo Realese. They might have referred to them that way. It might reflect the current leadership. And yeah, Valachi was Neapolitan. He was a Lucchese associate, proposed for membership by the Lucchese family when Pinzola was still boss. His sponsor was Petrilli, who was, I believe, Abruzzese from the mainland. During the war, things get chaotic. These designations get chaotic. They're answering to Maranzano, who heads their rebel faction. Maranzano, after the war, says, anybody who was with me during the war can come be with me now. Valachi says, sure. He liked Maranzano as his advocate. Lucchese says, no, this is a mistake. Because Tommy Lucchese would have understood Valachi was proposed into our family. And Valachi goes with Maranzano anyway. And it's good to look at his Senate testimony, his manuscript, and his book, because he talks in his book, as well as the other places, about how he was schooled by a Camorra member, Valero, who was part of the war with the Morellos, and how Valero cautioned him, be careful of Sicilians. You can be close to them for 20 years, and they'll turn on you, in favor of another Sicilian in a second. And Valachi said Valero was never made into Cosa Nostra. And Valachi said after the war, when Maranzano was killed and he was trying to find a landing place, he was told by Bobby Santuccio, go with Vito. In his Senate testimony, though, he says the words of Valero came back to him about the Sicilians. And they asked him about that. And he specifically says Vito was Neapolitan. And so his heritage does seem to have played a role in him ultimately transferring to the Genovese family.
Yep.
So I wanted to go back a little bit, provide some more information about Joe Masseria. In going about his background, his father, Giuseppe Joe Sr., apparently moved to Cleveland after the death of his wife in 1911. And so it looks like a number of brothers went there. It wasn't just one or two, it was several. And one was notably involved in an Italian community organization in the 1910s. And so, they were pretty entrenched over there. And I think their connection to Cleveland probably goes back a long ways.
Yeah,
And so I wanted to
interestingly,
get that part out. Pardon me?
interestingly, I believe it's a Secret Service report that Angelo showed me. Charles Masseria, who I believe is Carlo. He had two brothers, Carlo and Calogero. I believe it's
He had
Carlo.
several brothers. There was
Well, I know he had
Vincenzo
several
James. There
brothers.
was
I know he had several brothers.
Samuel.
He had brothers. He had two brothers. One was named Carlo, and one was named Calogero, which in the U.S. become Charles. And a Charles
Right.
Masseria, I believe, is Carlo based on the timeline. And Carlo Masseria was linked to Joe Leonardo in the 1910s. And then Gentile talks about how one of Masseria's brothers was part of the Cleveland family around 1930 and had a dispute with the local leadership. And Joe Masseria, who was then the national capo, actually sided against his brother, who might have been Carlo Charles. So it's interesting that Joe Masseria didn't just go along with his brother in Cleveland, because we know Masseria was close to the Morellos, who were rivals.
Yeah, I don't think we're really certain which brother it was because there were so many brothers out there. And, more than one could have been connected, made members over there. Uh, Whoever it was apparently supported a member named Angelo Antona. And this had to be right after the death of Joe Morello, I imagine. And so Frank Milano and Giuseppe Romano, who was said to be his underboss, filed a complaint and went to Masseria. And Masseria came and intervened and told his brother if he didn't listen to Milano, that the death penalty would apply to him too.
And Milano might have been the first mainlander to be boss of a Cosa Nostra family in America. He was Calabrian. I think Gentile says
Before Capone.
yeah.
Yeah.
I want to add, funny enough, I was going through FBI files one day and I came across like a surveillance log of Cleveland boss John Scalish's house in the 1960s. And a car was parked there that was registered to a Vita Masseria, a woman's name. Turns out that was Joe Masseria's niece, the daughter of Salvatore, and she was married to a very close associate of John Scalish, who obviously was welcome at his home and everything. I don't think the guy was made. I want to say his name was like Tony Gaddy or something. But I was reading it and I was like, Cleveland, Masseria, wow. Like it shows you that even Joe Masseria's niece's husband, who probably wasn't a member since Cleveland, Scalish didn't make anybody, according to Leonardo.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
it shows
named after Joe Masseria's mother,
okay.
Vitina.
There you go.
Vita is short for Vitina, and Joe Masseria's own daughter was Vita, Vitina Vita. And I wanted to get this point out, because people like Joe Masseria, we only see one side of them, the criminal side. And I was able to learn a personal side about him, that he loved his daughter very much. And she had asthma, apparently severe asthma. And she was as heartbroken after he was murdered in 1931. He had put her up I was told, in a high rise on the west side. And after her father's murder, they couldn't cover that anymore. So she had to go back and live with the rest of the family. And um, she was grieving, and she'd been sick for 2 weeks and died just I think in early May 1931, just little over 2 weeks after her father's murder.
Yeah.
You should have told Joe Bonanno. You're like, hey, that guy that you were disparaging was a sweet father. But
In between eating everything, he was
that's an important part of this. These guys weren't one dimensional at all, and the same is true for Joe Masseria. Even though there's a narrative surrounding who he was within the mafia. And I want to add too that he had a brother John who stayed in the New York area. I think he lived in New Jersey, and he was killed in 1937. And I don't know if he was a made member or what the circumstances were of his death, but I always found it interesting that Masseria had a brother who was killed 6 years after him. And what happened? What was John Masseria doing? We know a lot of bosses die or step down.
Mm-hmm.
Their relatives stay members, associates in and around the life. But it's like a guy of Masseria's stature. It's like, what was John Masseria doing? What got him killed?
Yeah, he was taken for a ride, one-way ride.
Yeah. Real quick, also, I think it's important. We've talked a lot about New York. We've brought up some other cities, right? But a guy who's angling to become boss of bosses, as Masseria did, is also at the head of the deliberative or judicial body that sort of governs the national mafia, right? The Grand Council, the Consiglio Supremo, whatever, different acronyms or different words that they used. And during he becomes boss, right? And then becomes boss of bosses. And in 1928, after D'Aguila is murdered, there's earlier. So I mentioned before the Capone thing in Chicago, right? There's the Chess de la Mare thing, which I think that might have come up when we were talking to Jimmy Bucciolato a little bit, right? Eric, you just mentioned a very interesting thing, right? The Morellos in Cleveland. So in 1927, right, Giuseppe Leonardo from Licata Agrigento, who had been the boss of the Cleveland family, was murdered. There's an internal war that breaks out between families that are all from Licata, so they're all paesani with each other, right? There can be very bloody battles that are fought for control, just like there are in Sicily, between people that might even be blood relatives over control of mafia power, right? It's easy when you have people like, say, Joe Aiello and Capone in Chicago to say, well, it must be a conflict between a mainlander and a Sicilian, right? We don't know. There can be really bloody battles fought between one paesani group. So there's a lot of there's bloodshed in Cleveland. We know, as you said, that the Morellos are connected to Masseria, who has not just one but multiple relatives for decades in Cleveland. Salvatore Todaro winds up becoming boss of the Cleveland family, right? I believe at that time. There's more than bloodshed sort of back and forth. This is in 1927. This is before the 1928 events. And I think that there's probably good reason to suspect that Masseria may have already been stirring the sort of waters, because we know that Joe Leonardo was very close to D'Aguila. And that was confirmed for us also by our friend Michael Di Leonardo, who's heard stories about this, about the connections with the Leonardos.
There was a baptismal relationship, right, where Michael's uncle was baptized by a Cleveland member who was killed, and Michael suspects it might even have been Leonardo himself.
Right.
We know the Di Leonardos were D'Aquila's diehard loyalists, so it makes sense, because Gentile says that the Leonardo faction was so loyal to D'Aquila that, like, he was scared to be there. There were spies. He fled to San Francisco, I believe it was, because the Leonardo group was so loyal to D'Aquila, whereas the Morellos were Masseria guys, and probably not so coincidentally, Leonardo's taken out by the Morellos, like you're getting at, yep, right as Masseria is doing the same thing, killing D'Aquila, killing these guys.
Building up
the Agrigento thing goes back to Masseria too, because Gentile saw him as a Shakatan, given his Menfi background.
Western
Agrigento. Yeah, I was going to say, even though that's at the far west of the province, and Licata's at the far east, this isn't a big place, and there's no Tropanese, there's no known Tropanese element in Cleveland. So it is interesting that the Masserias were involved with the Cleveland family, whose original identity was very Agrigentino.
Well, we've talked about his connections to Marsala, right? So because of the Shakatani thing, his connection to Menfi, his being Masseria, right? That's obviously highlighted because we have Gentili, who is an Agrigentino, right? So we get sort of that focus, right? We aren't otherwise really able to place him within a Trapanese and a specifically Marseillaise network. But Marsala was an important city in Trapani, right? It was an important mafia city, and in Chicago as well as some other places, there's a bunch of mafiosi from Marsala and the thereabouts in Trapani, right? And there's the famous Jenna brothers on Taylor Street, and we know you get all these things about the Jenna gang, the Yellow gang, and all this stuff. That's not actually what was happening. We know from Gentili that these were all members of the Chicago Mafia. That after Michele Merlo, who was an Agrigentino boss in Chicago, dies of natural causes in 1924, that the Jenner brothers try to seize. There's essentially, as there was a lot during this time period, there was an attempt to seize by force control of the family. Right, there was a contest over this. Gentili was sent along with some other rappresentante. This is when he was affiliated, I believe, with the Kansas City family, to as a sort of panel to iron out this conflict. And the conflict was between them and Tony Lombardo and Joe Aiello, who become the boss and the underboss after this, after the thing is ironed out. But then a couple of the Jennas and a bunch of their guys, who are mostly guys from Marsala, Castelvetrano, and so forth, around Taylor Street, as well as some other odds and ends, Sicilians and Napolitani and different people. Bunch of people get whacked out in Chicago in 1925 and 1926. We don't exactly understand what was happening, but there was definitely, there was if we were to call that a Marseillaise, right, network, that was definitely one, even if they had other people in their orbit, right? It's interesting. Then seems that something they got ironed out, and for some reason, all these guys get whacked out. Lombardo and Joe Aiello are then the boss and the underboss. Interesting. Capone gets brought in, and Masseria is like, "Yeah, I'll bring you in, but you got to kill these two guys."
Yeah, Masseria took a great interest in Chicago, and so I think maybe there were some machinations by him earlier on before he sponsors Capone and all that. But I think in summary, we can see that just like these mainlanders didn't exist in a vacuum, neither did Masseria. He had connections across the country, and it does seem like his rise in power coincided with him pulling strings and trying to influence things even before that comes to a head in 1928 through 1931.
Yeah. And we don't know the extent of his connections, right? We don't know the extent of the conflicts that occurred and who lined up on what side and who betrayed who and who changed sides over time. That just because you're with one guy in 1921 doesn't mean you're actually, and I'm not saying with in a formal sense, I'm saying with in terms of factionalism, forming a block. It could be guys in different families who are conniving with each other, conspiring. This happens all the time in the mob, right? We don't know how these things changed over time. We have some good accounts. We have Gentili, we have Bonanno, we have a few other accounts that are good accounts, right? But that's partial. Those guys have their own perspective, their own point of view, even their own biases, right? Gentili is biased towards Sicilians in general and somewhat towards Agrigentini, right? Obviously, Joe Bonanno wears his biases proudly on his shoulders as if it were the stars of a general, So there's a lot of other people that were involved in these things and who were important and may have had even more insight because they might have been more directly involved, right?
Yeah.
And we don't know. We don't know what they would have said, right?
And to kind of summarize the whole conversation, I think what we're getting at here is that it's very easy to kind of typecast the Genovese family when it broke off from the Morellos and say it was this. It was just a rebel faction with a small minority of Morello members. And Joe Masseria recruited all these guys who were unaffiliated previously. Luccheses were the true family. Angelo's made some great points about that before. You can't really see either one as the true successor because the Genovese family was complex. It had all kinds of internal influences. It had all kind of external influences. And we really only know the tip of the iceberg, given most of our sources were anti-Masseria. So I think we've hit on some really good points here about like what the family consisted of, who Joe Masseria was, who he was connected to. As we can see right now, there's a million jumping off points connected to other cities. We haven't even really gone as deep into the Genoveses as we could. And the Luccheses are another important part of this, who we'll save for another time. But yeah, it was a very complex situation when Masseria became boss, and then when he gained even more power as the national capo.
Yeah, I think the Luccheses mirrored a lot of their own. We've obviously focused a lot more on the Masseria family, but the Lucchese family over its history is actually, I think more mysterious in many ways. It's secretive. It has a smaller membership. We're told at a later point that they're much later point that they're basically wary about introducing their members to members of other families unless they need to, right? A lot of them, we know later on, they're heavily involved in narcotics trafficking, right, amongst a bunch of other things.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
But they maintained, in closing,
Yep.
who are the two closest families, for generations in New York, or two of the closest. Just like Bonanno and Profaci formed this close alliance for decades, we see the Genovese and Luccheses remained very close, to the point where sources often didn't know who was a member of which until the FBI started getting more concrete information on the organization. So even though they split, there was warfare, there were problems both in the early 20s, late 20s, early 30s. We still see that these two families who share the same root remained incredibly close.
If I may say something, after the breakup, you would have expected tension between what became the Genoveses and Luccheses, but in 1924, 1925, Morello and Tom Reyna went into a business together. Just to give an idea that whatever happened, it got patched up.
Yeah.
And Morello might well have been influencing that family from the Genovese family. Some of what Masseria is accused of doing, taking out Rena. We know these relationships are hot and cold. So for all we know, it was Morello. And it's Morello's murder in 1930 that seems to have taken the wind out of Masseria's sails. He's deposed as the national capo. He stays boss of his own family, but he's taken down as capo de capi, replaced by temporarily by Gaspar Messina. And but we know in early 1931, he's telling his members, disarm, the law is after us. His family gets disgruntled, they kill him. But it seems like, who knows how many different factors influenced it, but it does seem to be Morello's murder that greatly, it coincides with Masseria wanting to take a step back, not wanting to cool down the war and everything.
Sealing his own fate and trying to do that. The way I look at it is Masseria also, he raised lions in his home, and those lions grew up.
And then what do we see today? The Genovese family boss has Corleonese heritage and his family comes from the old Ciro Terranova crew, which was Morello's brother, who was a captain under Masseria. So it's interesting that the current boss has roots in that same faction. He's Corleonese, just like, so it tells you can't completely discount the Corleonese element in the Genovese, even though it seems to have been a minority compared to the Luccheses.
We're talking about 120 years of history in East Harlem and the Bronx at this point.
Yep.
All right, everyone. This has been our episode. I'd like to thank Anthony, Eric, and Rick, who unfortunately had to take off real quick. We wish you guys a great evening.